Hello there, lovely listener. My name is Jorja McAndrew, and welcome to the Graham Sibbald Podcast, where we talk all things surveying. This week on the podcast, we are joined by another integral member of the Graham Sibbald team to chat about what it means to be a chartered planner, as well as the process of changing a property's use. So with no further ado, on with the show. Welcome to the Graham Sibbald Podcast. We are here today with Murray Rankin, who is a chartered planner at Graham Sibbald, based within their Glasgow office. Good morning, Murray. How are you today?
Hi, Jorja. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm really good. So, Murray, as just mentioned, you are a chartered planner. Could you tell us a little bit what this role entails?
Yeah, sure. So I'm based in our Glasgow office, and I provide a variety of planning consultancy services that really just to suit whatever needs that our clients have. So this can be providing guidance or advice on what to do with a potential development site, developing a strategy to sort of minimise friction with getting any development proposals through the planning system. And then we can get involved with actually taking that proposal through the planning system and doing the planning applications, preparing the applications, sort of coordinating consultants or any specialist input that we might need, engaging with the councils and the planning authorities, and just kind of ensuring that the application has as smooth a process as possible. So yeah, that's probably our primary function. Yeah.
Fantastic. So just for some more clarification, what does it mean to change the use of a property or a piece of land, and how can a chartered planner help with this?
Sure. So in Scotland, every building or bit of land kind of has a use class, which is essentially a categorisation of the type of activity that you're permitted to undertake there. So a planning authority will use use classes to decide whether a proposal is generally acceptable in the surrounding, in certain locations, and whether these are kind of compatible with what's going on in the surrounding area. So it's just kind of a way of regulating land use and ensuring that these don't come into conflict. To give an example, a factory is class 5 and houses are class 9. So usually you wouldn't get a class 5 permitted anywhere near other class 9 uses, just because these are potentially conflicting uses. So changing a use is pretty much as it sounds. It's just making a change to the approved use of a property or a building. For some changes, these can be done without having to get planning permission because they're pre-approved or permitted development. So they're something that's just been identified as not being contentious and just being allowed to go ahead without having to go through the planning process. So, for example, changing a restaurant or a cafe, which is class 3, to a shop as class 1. Because these are fairly complementary uses. So it's important to note that those permitted changes don't always go both ways. So it can be important to check that just beforehand. And any change that's not permitted does require planning permission, which is where we come in and we do the change of use. So the planning process is really just to make the case about why the change is acceptable, give the planning authority the opportunity to assess the new use against the current environment, against the planning policy, and just make the judgment on whether it will cause any new conflicts with the surrounding area. So yeah, as planners, we get involved at that stage, and we make the case to the planning authority, compile supporting information, and just make the argument in favour of a change. And yeah, all going well, we'll then get the approval for the change.
Okay, amazing. A few things going on there. So from like the initial instruction of a planner, how long does the change of use process usually take?
We can usually get an application drafted and submitted within about 2 weeks of instruction, and in normal times there's an 8-week period that councils are bound to. That's set out in legislation, and while they are still obliged to meet that, we're finding that does vary a bit at the moment, just with home working and COVID putting a strain on councils' resources. So it's kind of variable as to how well they're able to stick to that deadline. So yeah, we would probably advise a wee bit of flexibility with those timeframes in the current climate. Anywhere between sort of 8 to 12 weeks is probably accurate.
Fab. And for people thinking of going through this process, how likely are they to be successful in a change of use request?
Well, that really depends on a number of factors. The first thing to consider is how compatible the changed use is going to be with the existing uses in an area. So just going back to my previous example of an industrial factory being proposed in a residential area, we'd probably not expect that to be successful unless there's some pretty stringent conditions going to be imposed on the operation, such as hours that it can operate, noise emissions, delivery times, things like that. So, and that's just because the planning system generally exists to direct development physically to appropriate locations where it's surrounded by similar compatible uses. So as a planner, that would probably be reflected in our initial advice to the client, that we would want to consider a different location for the type of use and see if there's any alternative locations that could be more appropriate. And another thing to consider is whether there's a precedent for this type of use at the location. This might be quite historic, and we can lean on that to make the case for why it can be brought back into an active use here. It's not always guaranteed to work, especially if over time an area has changed. Maybe the character of an area has become more residential or more commercial or something like that. That might no longer be compatible with a proposed use. But it can be a compelling argument to make in the right circumstances. But probably the main factor to consider is planning policy, and this is probably where most planning applications for changes of use do fall down. Most planning authorities have pretty prescriptive policies about certain changes of use that can make it difficult to get through. And this is particularly true of changes of use involving a retail unit changing to something else, particularly if it's located in a town or a city centre location. As you know, local authorities are quite keen to sort of retain the shopping function of town centres and city centres, and using planning policies like that is one of our main mechanisms for holding on to that. And generally, this will only be allowed in very certain conditions, or if it's a very compelling argument that overrides the policy requirements. So it can vary. Some are very straightforward, while others are a bit more challenging, and really it needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and what about like legal implications? Are there any? If I was to fail to obtain the relevant permissions, would there be any legal implications?
Yes, so carrying out a use of a property or land that's not been approved by the council is called unauthorised development, and this can lead to enforcement action being taken. Usually you'll be given a chance to regularise this through a retrospective planning application, but there's not always a guarantee that that's going to be granted, and there can be fines involved for not having the right consents in place. So it's really best to begin the process of applying for planning permission as early as possible and getting consent before you start carrying out any development or undertaking any new activities at a property.
Brilliant. And is there anything else you'd like to add? I don't know, anything about costs or potential challenges that may arise?
Sometimes additional consents can be needed depending on the location. So if it's a listed building, for example, you'll need to get listed building consent, particularly if you're proposing to undertake any internal or external changes to the structure of the building. Putting up new signage as well is something that quite often gets kind of forgotten about, but if you wanted to put up new advertising features, for example, on the front of your shop or your business, that needs advertising consent. And both of these are separate applications that kind of run concurrently with the planning application process, but they are their own applications, and we can also assist with those when they're needed. So that's probably a big one that often goes under the radar. It's often advisable as well to get things like floor plans and drawings that might be required for this in as far in advance as possible. And these will be required, particularly if you're sort of proposing to carry out any changes to the layout of the building, take down any walls or alter the building in any way. So, and that's something that we can assist with as well. We've got our in-house architecture team who can chip in on that as well. So, and as with all planning applications, there's also fees to consider. Sometimes there's a fee to the local authority, and that will, we can advise that at the time, depending on what the proposal is. So, just a few other things to consider.
Brilliant, that's great. I think that'll be really helpful for our listeners. And I think that's all for today. Thank you for telling us all about chartered planning and the change of use process. It's been a pleasure. You're very welcome. Thanks very much. Thank you again to Murray for his time today. If you have any questions or would like to find out more, please go to www.g-s.co.uk. As always, you can catch up on all our podcasts via the playlist on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to you joining us again next time. This was the Graham Sibbald Podcast, produced and presented by Jorja McAndrew.